We're excited for this presentation today, Loving the Life in Your Soils. I'm Joyce Kennedy with People and Pollinators Action Network. PPAN is an advocacy organization and education as well, and we are working across Colorado to improve policies to better protect pollinators, people, and biodiversity by increasing safe habitat, improving land management practices, and reducing pesticide use. We're building strong relationships and partnerships at the state and local level. And also the connections we build with all of you attending today are particularly important as we work to address the many threats to pollinator health. We invite you to be involved in this critical work. And I'm just taking a moment to alert you to one time-sensitive action that you can take, and that is to support the creation of a new Colorado pollinator license plate. PPAN is currently working with state legislators to move this bill forward. So if you have a moment, please let your legislators know that you support a new pollinator license plate, and that's House Bill 21-1145. And if you happen to represent an organization or business that's interested in supporting the bill, we will provide a link to that in the chat so that you can endorse it. Thankfully, there is a growing recognition of the vital importance of healthy soils. And since soils are so important to a living, dynamic ecosystem, the foundation of our food system, and can build resilience in the face of climate change. As we turn our attention to the growing season, let's examine how we can best love our soil. We're lucky today to have Dr. Julie Morris, who is a PPAN board member and associate teaching professor in the Department of Biological Services at the University of Denver. Her work focuses on biology, education, and outreach, especially environmental education and strategies to improve engagement and learning effectiveness in large introductory and non-majors biology courses. She's passionate about preserving biodiversity and is actively involved in several sustainability initiatives on DU's campus and the Denver community. This includes managing DU's community garden and advising 2 undergraduate student organizations, the DU Pollination Association and Botanical Society. Welcome to Julie. Please do keep your microphone muted during the presentation, and you can use the chat box for questions. When you pose a question, please address your questions for all to see, and we'll do our best to answer them at the conclusion of the presentation. We will be recording this presentation and posting it to our YouTube channel soon, and we will share a link to the PPAN YouTube channel this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Danielle Owenby, PPAN's intern from the Anschutz Masters of Public Health program, for her technical support today. Please take it away, Julie.
Thanks, Joyce. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. It's great to sort of virtually see all of you out there. Looking forward to the times when we can all get in a room or a garden together somewhere. And I will say a few things about sort of my expertise and how I came to love the life in our soils and want to share that with anybody who would listen. So I am not an expert in soil biology. I will say that's not. I got my Ph.D. studying plant biology and pollination ecology, those kinds of things. And a lot of my love for soils came afterwards. I'm also a avid gardener and help with the community garden on campus. And so my love of all of this started with the plants and has spread out as I understand more and more about all of the connections in an ecosystem that keep our natural ecosystems and also our garden ecosystems alive and happy. And so a lot of what I am going to talk about today, I have learned through studying these things and having an interest in biodiversity in general, and wanting to find ways to communicate about these connections. So because I think when people have a greater understanding of how all of this invisible life in our soils impacts the health of our plants, and then how our plants impact the health of our insects, and how the insects impact the health of our birds, and how all of that together impacts human health. That's when we can do the most, the most potentially positive things. So with that said, this is sort of the second in the series, and possibly, right, if there's interest, we'll do more. There's always more that can be said. So in my first PPAN webinar about soils, I introduced a few things which I'll review a bit today in case you weren't able to join us the first time, or it's been a little while. Some things have happened since that last webinar. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about why we care about the life in our soils. So I think it's really important to understand that it's a common misconception that soil is just dirt. It's just dirt. And it's the thing is, right, soil, the difference between dirt and soil is that soil is alive, and soil does a lot of things for us. There's a concept sort of in sustainability called ecosystem services, right? These are all of the many things that healthy, happy ecosystems provide to humans. And soils are an incredibly important part of that, from controlling how much carbon is in our soil to that helps us regulate our climate, to, more obviously, supporting our plants, things like nutrient cycling, helping with flood prevention. All of these kinds of things are very important parts of what soils do for us. And soil has some, right? So if you had to have the cookbook of what makes a healthy soil, there's basically 5 ingredients to make it very simple. And so I'm just going to quickly review these and then spend most of today talking about how we can keep our soils healthy, what we have learned about what makes soils healthy. So just talking a little bit about the non-living components of soil, right? Soil, you probably realize that different areas have different types of soil, and those different soils are often kind of given some behaviors from the parent materials. So, right, there's certain elements out there in the world, lovely periodic table of elements. And the things that we call minerals are sort of solid mixes of these periodic table of elements. So a common mineral like quartz has silica and oxygen in it. And then these different minerals are mixed together by the various physical processes on our planet to create the things that we call rocks, right? Through different processes. And over time, through processes of weathering and erosion, these rocks break down, and the fragments are moved by wind and water and layered in different ways. And these processes are what sort of partially determine soil texture. Some of soil texture is also determined by the life that is in it, and we will come back to that. But right, sort of soil texture has a lot to do with the size of the particles in the soil. Everything from sort of larger particles like gravel and sand, and smaller particles like clay. And this particle size and sort of characteristics of the particle are what gives soil what we call porosity and permeability. And this is sort of has to do more with the space in between the particles. And that space is important for a couple of different reasons. It allows mainly, right, the air and the water to move through the soil, which is very important for all the life that's there, because these things are necessary for the life, and the life is what we are really interested in when we talk about soil. And so given all of that, then we get to the living parts. An important part of organic or of soils is what we call organic matter. You might have heard instructions that adding organic materials to your soil is a helpful thing, and it is. So what is organic matter? I want to take a second to point out that what we mean here by organic is not organic like organic vegetables in the grocery store. It's organic like organic chemistry. And what scientists mean when they talk about organic chemistry is mainly sort of carbon containing and chemistry related to life or processes around life. So it has a lot to do with carbon. We'll come back to carbon for sure. Okay, so when you look at the different parts of organic matter in soil, there is a large component of it that's no longer living. Okay. There is some living organisms, but then there are sort of different components that I like to call the dead and the very dead, depending upon how long ago that these components were alive. So this is sort of the living things that are returning nutrients to the soil, and part of the nutrient cycling processes that are so important. And all of these things support the living organisms. And often the living organisms are kind of overlooked for their importance with respect to health of soils. Often we think about earthworms, right? Most grade school kids can tell you how important it is to have earthworms in your garden. And sometimes they're even better than my college kids in telling me why those earthworms are important in there. But it's important to realize that it's not just earthworms down there. There is a lot of diversity. And in my last talk, I spent some time talking about what all of these organisms are and what they're doing. So I'm not going to dwell on that again too much today. But I just want to mention a few sort of take-home messages about all of the life in there. First one is there's a lot of it, way more than you would realize, because a lot of it is invisible, and it's stuff that we walk over every day. And unless you're really in there and digging around and having a bunch of even specialized tools and scientific equipment, it's hard to know what's in there. But if you sort of think about, right, 1 square meter of soil and one sort of large organism like a human or a bird, in order to support that organism on the surface, it requires huge numbers, right? If you look, there's a lot of zeros in these things down here. And a lot of this with the largest numbers and potentially the largest impact is invisible. Doesn't mean just because we can't see it that it's not doing incredibly important things. And honestly, we've just figured out how potentially to see and sample it all. That's relatively new, and some new technology like being able to look at genetic sequences and sample those things in an environment are allowing us to realize that what we thought was that we were underestimating the diversity and the number of things by significant amounts. Sort of old technology, we would have taken some soil and maybe put it on a petri dish. You might remember from an old biology class at some point. And if something was there, it would grow on the plate, and then you'd get a lot of it and you could study. It turns out we just don't know how to grow some of that. So just because it didn't grow on the plate doesn't mean it's not there. And we now have technology that is allowing us to look, for example, for the genes of the things, the DNA of the things that are there, and allow us to get a much more accurate picture of what is there. So we're still in the exploratory stages. It's like we discovered a new planet and we're just cataloging. We're just in the stages of cataloging that. We know very little about how it all acts. And that's where sort of current and future research is going. Okay. Another important take-home message is that all of this life is interacting. In the same way that living things interact in a rainforest, you know, all of the different, you might have heard about food chains or food webs, and think about, you know, who eats who and who competes with who, and how does energy flow through an ecosystem. All of that is happening with all of these living things as well. And there are top predators, and there are herbivores, and there are decomposers, and all of these things are having an impact. And what we've learned by studying above ground ecosystems is that when you start removing pieces from this puzzle, it does a few things. It sort of imbalances the system, and it decreases the functional output of the systems. So understanding that in a little teaspoon or a square meter of soil, there's an entire ecosystem is a useful thing to understand. And it's really these interactions that are important. And then the functions, you know, the things that we think about, like modifying soil structure and water availability, allowing for waste to decompose and nutrients to cycle in an ecosystem, and the ability to help plants acquire water and nutrients. And it turns out also helps fight diseases and pests. All of this function comes out of these complex interactions. And this is sort of, you know, where current study is working on understanding what organisms are doing that provides these functions, and how we can support them in their work. So again, right, these ecosystem services that I spoke about earlier don't come from the dirt. They come from the living soil. And when we do things that make our soil less healthy, then these functions and these services go away. So we're learning that the hard way, and hopefully soon enough that we can turn around some of our behaviors in a way that supports these things in the end. Okay, so what I want to spend kind of the next little bit on is sort of practically, what have we learned about how we can support, now that we know that life is in there and how important it is, what can we do to support that work? Okay, and mainly the take-home message is do things that support the life that is in there. And the easiest sort of most impactful things that can be done are minimizing soil disturbance, which goes against some of our old ways of thinking and doing. And I'll talk about that in a minute. There's lots of ways that we disturb this system by our old ways of, our traditional ways of, and especially the more recent industrial ways that we potentially manage soils. And then the other thing really important to do is to increase plant diversity. So, and this has lots of impacts, including the health of our soils. The problem is, you know, in our agricultural systems, for example, we have what we call monocultures. Think of a huge field of corn or soybeans. There's just one type of plant over a wide area. And that, it turns out, has an impact. And it's easy to blame our agricultural systems and not pay attention to our own backyards. A lawn is a monoculture in exactly the same way that that a cornfield is a monoculture. And, the combination of sort of our urban and suburban lawns and our agricultural monocultures have decreased plant diversity. And when you decrease plant diversity, then you decrease a lot of other aspects of diversity. And so by increasing plant diversity, you can help the soil, which then has a lot of then cascading beneficial impacts as well. Okay, so minimizing disturbance. Let's talk about that one first. What that means, sort of to summarize, is less digging, less tilling. We'll talk about why that's a good idea. Getting away from synthetic chemicals, so pesticides and herbicides, but also synthetic fertilizers. Turns out all of those sometimes have sort of maybe short-term benefits to the particular plant of interest in front of us, but many side effects and long-term detrimental effects. So as we look at these things over the long term, we're realizing that there are a lot of there's too many side effects to these things, both to the health of the soil and the surrounding ecosystems. And then really thinking about covering your soil. Okay? Cover crops, mulch, and compost, all of these things are useful in sort of maintaining the life in the soil and supporting it in a way that will allow you to grow what you want to grow there. Okay? So let's talk about tilling first. So, on a small scale, it's spring. We're all getting excited to go and dig up the garden, right? You're supposed to till first and get it all ready for to plant the seeds. And whether we're doing that on a small scale in our backyards, or whether we're doing that in a very large scale in our industrial farms, it turns out that again, there may be some short-term benefits to this, depending upon what you're trying to grow and what you're starting with as far as soil conditions. But the long term, it actually is causing more damage, and especially to the life that is in there. So one thing that tilling does is disturb in soils. It turns out that there are lots of microorganisms, and I talked about mycorrhizae a little bit in my last talk, so I'm only going to kind of summarize what they do. But it turns out there's a very important relationship between the fungi that lives in the soil, in and around plant roots and the plants. So fungi are very weird little organisms. Instead of sort of having layers of tissues like the plants and animals that we're more familiar with, fungi are they grow as a bunch of tiny little threads, like one cell layer thick. And these threads, because they're so small, very tiny, just a few microns, like micrometers we're talking, then they have a tremendous amount of surface area. Fungi live in their food instead of having to run around and catch food. And they do what's called extracellular digestion. So they secrete their instead of having a digestive system with a stomach and a mouth, they just secrete digestive enzymes into their environment, break down things around them, and then absorb the nutrients that they need. So they have a tremendous amount of surface area, and they're master absorbers. That's kind of their skill set. And plants have different skills, right? Probably you're more familiar with. Plants can do this amazing thing called photosynthesis, right? Where they're taking raw materials, carbon dioxide from the air and energy from the sun, and putting it together into this wonderful molecule called sugar. And sugar is the energy molecule of living things, both plants and animals and fungi. Life uses sugar molecules to break down and power themselves. Okay, so because the fungi are living in and around the roots, right? Sometimes we think about fungi, maybe the misconception is that this is an infection and it's potentially harmful to the plant. It's going to cause rot or something. But it turns out most of these fungi are actually helpful and have this relationship. And because they have this surface area and are master absorbers, they can reach much more of the soil, both to collect water and nutrients, than plant roots. When you dig up a plant, it seems like there's very fine little roots, but the difference in, a few millimeter of plant roots and much tinier, much finer thread-like, just like a cell width, is able to access much more of the soil and help plants. Okay. And these fungi often grow around the roots or sometimes actually into the plant tissues themselves. And sometimes, for example, if you see mushrooms popping up around a tree, we might think about that as being a bad thing, but in truth, this could just be part of the fungus that is in the relationship with the plants. Okay. And what happens is they have this sort of interchange of skills. The fungus can't photosynthesize. They're consumers, just like animals, but they really like the sugar. They also need the sugar for energy, but they can't make it. But they're much better at getting soil nutrients and water, and these organisms basically share. The plants attract the fungus, they feed the fungus the sugars that they make through photosynthesis, and in exchange, the fungus gives nutrients and water, more nutrients and water to the plant. Okay. And the more that we sort of understand these relationships, we realize that it makes a huge difference. So these are two little pine trees that are clones of each other, so genetically identical, the same age, but you can see sort of the difference in growth between the little guy that was grown with his fungal friends and the one that was grown without the fungal friends. So the plant can still survive, but it's clearly not as prosperous. Okay. And it turns out a lot of the things that we have credited plants for doing, like bringing nutrients from the soil and making it available to other parts of the organisms, those of us who eat the plants to keep ourselves alive, that a lot of that uptake of particular nutrients is actually the microbial things living around the plant roots, not the plants themselves. And so it turns out that there's actually more nutrients in the plants that have fungal partners in addition to than the ones that don't have fungal partners. Okay, so when we dig and we till, it one of the most important things it does is it cuts up this network, right? Think about this sort of network of fibrous fungal hyphae that are doing all of these important things. And if you chop it to bits, the network doesn't work. So it's not just about disturbing the plant roots, it's also disturbing the fungal community that's around the plant roots, because most of that's invisible to us. We didn't realize what we were doing. Okay? And it takes a while for it to establish. And so if we're digging every season, we're just making it basically start from scratch. And it turns out that that doesn't support this as well. In addition to the fungal network, it's also, think about, chopping up all of the other life in there. Think about the microinvertebrates, all the little tiny insects and worms that are doing other important things. You're disturbing, it's like you're cutting down the rainforest and then expecting, just to plant the big trees again. It doesn't work very well. Also, another sort of impactful thing with respect to tilling is that when you disturb the soil like that, it's bringing up things to the surface. The soil dries out faster, right? So we have more water loss. It's exposed to more extremes in temperature when you turn it over. And so, all of those little bacteria and fungi require a certain environment to live, just like animals. And when you're changing that environment by impacting the temperature and the water availability, all of those things in addition to the structure. And when you do that, there's also now evidence that tilled soil does not hold as much carbon. And it's a whole nother seminar about carbon cycles, but carbon cycles have made it in the news a lot more recently because of the increasing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we're worried about that because that then traps more heat and causes climate change. So we're really interested in ways of capturing, right, being able to take carbon dioxide out of the air and capture it into other places. And soil is one of the most important storage places for carbon other than the atmosphere. It actually stores more carbon than the atmosphere and could potentially help us balance that entire story as well. So disturbing the soil releases more carbon, it disturbs the life, and it increases things like erosion. So everyone's probably aware that topsoil is a precious commodity, and we worry about how erosion is removing the topsoil because that's the part that holds the life. But if you have a very healthy soil, erosion does not happen at the same rate. And so tilling has also increased erosion. All of those things together makes us reconsider all of this digging and tilling that we have done. The other thing, sort of bad habit that we have gotten into is using synthetic chemicals. Think pesticides of any kind of pest, so fungicide, insecticide, herbicide, all of these things are basically poisons. Okay? And we sort of short-sightedly interested in the one pest or the one plant problem have looked for an easy solution. And again, it's easy, but these chemicals basically disturb that life. And it's not just the focus organism, the focus insect, or the focus weed that we are most concerned about in a particular system, but it's all the other life there that's being impacted as well. In addition, these things, right, as we imbalance the system, we have to use more and more of these chemicals. So there's less nutrients in the soil. We put on more synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus. The plants are less healthy, are more liable to be impacted by pests. So we have to put on more pesticides. They're in a disturbed systems, weeds are more likely, and so we have to use more herbicides. And it's kind of this unfortunate kind of circle of bad things. As we put more of these things on, it disturbs the system, and so then we need more of them, and so we put more of them on. In addition, synthetic fertilizers are not absorbed as effectively by the life there as organic fertilizers. And so a lot of it that we put on, close to 40-50% of what we're actually adding onto the fields is just running off. It's actually not, we're expending a great deal of fossil fuels and money putting these fertilizers on, and only a part of it is actually going into contributing to the whatever we want to grow here, be that our crop or our garden. The rest is running off into our aquatic ecosystems, our rivers, lakes, and oceans, and causing all kind of imbalancing in those systems as well. Think algae blooms in our lakes and coastal areas, think dead zones, right, which are more and more in the news in places like the Gulf of Mexico. And it's because of things that, right, the chemicals that we are putting on our gardens and our fields here in Denver are washing off into our rivers and headed out to the Gulf of Mexico, right? So when we hear about an algae bloom on the coast of Florida or a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, we're partially to blame for that as well. So these disturbances, the chemicals that we're using and the tilling that we're doing are affecting the life in negative ways. And we can talk a little bit about what to do instead. How do you plant a garden without digging? There are and I'll give you some resources at the end, but if you just Google sort of no-till or no-dig garden movements, you will find lots of information about how to get started. But it turns out if you just put stuff on the surface, right, if you add compost and good things to the surface, the life will take it down. You don't have to till it up. And the nice thing about that is it's actually less work as well. So one of these sort of win-win types of things. Okay. The other really important thing that we can do in addition to decreasing disturbance is actually increasing diversity. So trying to move away from our monoculture. And, on a small scale, these are things like get rid of our lawns and growing a pollinator garden there instead. And the more different plants that you have, right, it turns out that there's a couple reasons for this. One is that diversity sort of attracts and supports diversity at other levels. So because we're also a pollinator group, we can talk about pollinators. The more different kinds of plants you have, the more different insects, more species of bees and more species of butterflies that you can attract. And the more of that you have, the more birds that you have. And so it turns out it's also important in the soil. Okay, so plants have ways of actually controlling and manipulating the life in the soil around them. And so in addition to the sugars that they're excreting from their roots, they're also, it turns out, excreting all kinds of chemical signals and plant hormones that are actually attracting beneficial microbes to their roots. So it's like a little signal. Come here and I will make a happy place for you to live. And these organisms are then attracted. And different plants are going to attract different microbes. Okay? And so the more plants you have, the more sort of diversity in microbes that you will have. Plants all have different specializations and different skills. And it turns out then as the microbes will then also pay the plants back by doing a couple of things. The good guys want to protect this source of food, and so they will actually defend the plants from other pest organisms that would cause disease in the plants. So the more diversity you have down here, the more stable the ecosystem, the less likely for diseases and pests that are problematic to the plant. Okay, so the more good guys, the less bad guys, sort of take home message there. And the more different plants that you have, it's kind of like, carrots are healthy for you, but if you just ate carrots for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you would still become malnourished because you need all of the diversity of nutrients to be healthy. It's a similar kind of thing. The other thing that we've learned by studying ecosystems in general is and the reason that we are concerned about biodiversity at every level is that diverse systems tend to be more resistant to change, to damage, which we're certainly concerned about in respect to things like facing climate change, and also more resilient, sort of. And resistance is sort of what it sounds like, being able to prevent damages from occurring, while resilience is the idea of sort of bouncing back. How disturbed can a system become? Rebuilding these systems after we've disturbed them becomes increasingly difficult. But the greater the diversity is, the more likely that they are able to bounce back if we change our ways. Okay? This is kind of small print, but it's increasingly sort of being understood that soil biodiversity, right, and these ecosystem functions are connected to human health impacts in a lot of different ways that impact things like the risk of disease, obvious things like food, but also lack of clean air and water. All of these things are impacting us, and if we find ways of increasing soil biodiversity, it can have lots of sort of potentially sort of expanding benefits, sort of win-win. That if we work on the base, then that improves things at all levels, including human health. So take home message, so that we have some time for questions as well. Is if we understand and care for the life in our soils by decreasing amount of disturbance, backing off on our synthetic biochemistry, and instead focusing on the balance in the system, because the more balanced the system, the less you actually need those chemicals. Okay? And adding organic compost and these kinds of things. If we focus on maintaining this ecosystem, then all of these extra benefits come as a side effect. There's a couple of resources I want to give. If you're just interested in, on a backyard scale, helping your own soils, I really love this book. It's called Grow Your Soils by Diane Measler. And I've got a website there, but if you just Google it, you can find it. And there was actually like a digital version for like $3. It's well worth the $3, because it goes back and sort of talks about all of the life, the food web in the soil, and some of these things that we've been talking about in more detail. It's kind of like a nice little easy to read and very user-friendly sort of cookbook to how to make good soils in your garden. If you're inspired to change the world and you want to change your career to be a soil food web consultant, Dr. Elaine Ingham is actually a very famous soil ecologist, and now has a website and works all over the world in sort of larger scales, helping everything from gardens to larger farms to sort of focus on things. And she's got classes that you can pay for, or just information on the website that is useful for learning some good things. So that's a good one. If you're interested on a larger scale, like you've got a farm, there are places like the Colorado Conservation Tillage Association, where people are working together to figure out, how can we change these systems? How can we change the tools that we have, and the methods that we use in order to do this on a scale that we can feed ourselves as our growing human population without destroying our natural ecosystems that we rely on so heavily. So those are just a few good ones that I found that I would highly recommend. And I think that leaves us at a space where we can start to to go through some of the questions, and happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was wonderful. And somebody said it in the chat well when they said they wished they'd learned like this back in chemistry class. So
Yeah.
thank you for putting it in terms that we can all understand and appreciate. We will send out the resources that Julie mentioned in a message later today. So don't worry if you didn't quite catch those. And I think you might also enjoy watching Julie's part 1 soil presentation from last year. And that is on our YouTube channel. And I will give you a link to that as well, because it was a great precursor to today. And I think there may even be a part 3. So we'll be hopeful about that.
Yeah.
And just wanted to mention that if you have been enjoying PPAN's webinar series, please consider making a donation so that we can continue to bring you these informative webinars. And you can do that at our website at peopleandpollinators.org. And we have time for questions. I'll just mention now so that when we wrap up, people can just disappear. We will be distributing a short survey this afternoon as well. We appreciate that feedback. We get new ideas for new content, so that's always helpful, what we can do better. And if you did sign up for this webinar, you're now on our e-news list, which has lots of information about what PPAN's up to and about future events. So let's dive into a few questions here. And there may be more coming into the chat box, but I'm going to start from the top and we'll do our best to work our way through.
Yeah. I lost track, so I'll just let you pick, Joyce. And
yeah. You know, I may have missed the context to this. Somebody said something about pharmaceuticals. Did you have examples of that? I may have missed what you said about pharmaceuticals.
I'm not sure that I said anything about pharmaceuticals, but right.
It was that was my question. It was on that little wheel that you had showed, all those little pie charts. Of all the things.
Yeah. So as a one of the services, one of the ecosystem services that that soils provide. So if you think about all of the life that's in there, right? We talked about the soil food web and the interactions, and you think about things like an antibiotic, for example, like penicillin. Where does penicillin come from? Right? It turns out that it's an excretion of a fungus. And so why is a fungus making a chemical that can kill bacteria? It's all about competition, right? So a lot of these things, especially it turns out antibiotics, we're finding new ones all the time coming from soil organisms because of all of this complex interactions. They are making lots of chemicals, right, to compete with each other or to kill each other. And if we learn sort of some things about what those chemicals are, then we can potentially right, and how they work, then we can potentially harness them for things like an antibiotic. Does that make sense?
Great, thank you. And this somewhat relates concern about the long-lasting and forever chemicals. Are there any methods being developed in the way of probiotics or otherwise to accelerate breakdown?
So, you know, there's a lot of research now into kind of understanding what we call microbiomes. So you might have heard the term microbiome in relation to the human microbiome, all the living organisms that are on us and in us. And again, we're in the very early exploratory stages of understanding what is there. And then we move to the next step, like how does our microbiome, the human microbiome, affect things like digestion and metabolism and immune system and mental health. Turns out all of these things are impacted by the health of our microbiome. So we're also looking at the microbiome of soils. And again, we barely know what's there, right? So we have to do that first stage of sort of catalyzing it. cataloging it, and there is a lot of work going on using new technology like what we call microbial genomics. You can just go out and take a scoop of soil, you can mix it up, and then you can extract all of the DNA out of there and match it against databases and see, like, is this stuff we've ever seen before? Do we know where it comes from? And there's also increasing technology at then looking at sort of the functional, what are all of these genes doing? Even if we don't know what it comes from, we might be able to learn something about the function. So we're still in this sort of describing the life in their stage, and then potentially looking at how we then might be able to manipulate that, manage it in a way. And we're still in the very early stages of that. So someone might, for example, sell you some probiotics to put on your soil, right? Or you can go and get, mycorrhizal inoculant to put out there. And I would I would suggest that it's not as easy as just pouring it out on the ground. It's kind of like reintroducing organisms to an environment. But then if you don't support those organisms in their environment, what they need to live, they'll just die again. So it's actually better to create, if you build it, they will come situation. If you create a happy environment for them, they will actually come from the ones that are natural there, and be more likely to sustain over time than if you just sprinkle some spores on the soil and hope for the best. I don't think there right now is like an easy solution, but for example, you can do things like make compost tea. If you haven't heard about compost tea, you should Google that. There's also some good stuff in that the book that I recommended about making compost teas, because that then increases the number of natural organisms, and then you can add those to the soil. But it's sort of, you need to think about supporting those organisms and adding them, both of those things together, in order to make it actually work and be sustainable.
Thanks, Julie. Some discussion about lawns. Question: if you're required to have a lawn, as some HOAs do, how can we increase the biodiversity there? I would say, just to jump in, overall native species of grasses are better. Of course, that might not be appropriate in an HOA, but I don't know, Julie, if you had a comment about that.
Well, what I would say, where I would start is actually educating the HOA. Like, could you change the rules of the HOA by educating your neighbors about why biodiversity is important. So this, for example, this Colorado pollinator habitat sign that we have, you could also, add a little, like, I'm also supporting soil biodiversity. And then, if you can be a spokesperson for why these things are important and how they impact human health, then HOAs, right, will sort of value having a flower garden out front instead of a grass. And these things can be very beautiful. So, I would say wherever you can, plant. If you've got to have lawn in the front, you have some lawn in the front, but then everywhere you can plant something else, plant other things, right? And think about also, in your little garden spaces, plant cover crops. Like, never have empty soil. Always have the soil covered with something. And if it's growing there, then that can become sort of living mulch for the next generation of things that you want to grow there. So I would start by trying to educate the HOA members.
Absolutely. And at the higher level, to think about policy changes in cities that might require you to keep your lawn at a particular height. We can maybe advocate for some no-mow zones. So there are ways to change things from the top down as well. Quite a bit of discussion in the chat generally. Thank you to all of those that are providing some good information. In terms of tilling alternatives, people mentioning permaculture techniques, top dressing. I think Julie referenced this as well. We don't need to turn up the soil. We can kind of work from the top down. In terms of repairing disturbed soils, I think that's time. Julie, maybe you have more comments about kind of waiting that out.
Yeah, I would say patience in general. You can certainly help, but if you're starting with baked sterile clay, you can speed up the process, right? And by doing that, it's just adding compost, adding organic matter, and then planting cover crops and whatever, right? Planting things in there so that it's feeding the soil, adding more compost, stopping the chemicals. And then over time, and you can do it fairly rapidly, you can start year one with a good layer of compost and some cover crops, and then you can work up over time. I think, I saw some things in the chat about sheet mulching. It's another good thing to sort of Google in sort of no dig or sheet mulching. And when I started with my grass, for example, which was in kind of a hard packed clay and not very healthy, just cover it all with cardboard year one, and pile good compost on the top. And maybe in the first year or two, you've got to bring in compost from, somewhere. You can get a dump truck of it, or you can buy it a bag at a time at the garden center, and just put it on top of the cardboard and plant stuff in it immediately. Cover crops and those kinds of things. And then you just keep building over time. Instead of digging, just build up, adding instead of subtracting.
Excellent advice. A bit of discussion about the no-tilling concept. I would say it is relatively new, though it's been adopted by the lead organizations, and NRCS and USDA and so forth now attest to the value of no-tilling. So there are a lot of educational resources with that. The danger can be that many large-scale agricultural settings have turned to no-till, but do continue to use synthetics. So it's kind of getting at both of those issues as being important. And we have turned to 1 o'clock, so I want to formally say thank you to all for attending. The hour always goes so quickly with Julie. And we will hang around for a few more minutes for anybody that would like to, just to answer a few more questions. You actually, you can sit tight for a minute, and maybe I'll list out a few others, Julie, and we can take
it. Sure. It's a occupational hazard being a professor. Like, I really love to answer questions, so I would be happy to stay here all day and talk about this stuff. It's what I love. So
yeah, well, we'll just take a few more minutes of your time, yeah. And again, we will send out resources after we're done. You touched on inoculating a new garden. It's with a mycorrhizal solution. Any more comments about that? Or we know native plants are a good match for local soils. So of course that's a good supporting factor as well.
Yeah, and if you're going to inoculate, instead of buying something foreign in a bag in the garden center, I think it's better just go out to a natural area, right? And collect some soil. It's got the life in it, and then come back and multiply that, right? So you can use that in your compost pile, right, as an inoculant. Use a little bit of soil from the forest or the prairie that's got the life in it, and then you can sprinkle that in your compost pile and feed it and multiply it and spread it out, and you're much more likely to get native things that are more adapted to our climate and our water regime. And, think about, you have to build the structure and the environment first before you release these organisms into the environment, right? If you release the organisms too early without providing support for them, they will just die. So I think building the structure and the happy environment for them. And then if you do want to inoculate, potentially think about going out and collecting a few natives to add to your compost pile.
Awesome. There was mention of a lack of worms in the soil and compost. I know some worms are actually not, can be non-native. So I always wonder how important they are. If we have other creatures in the soil, maybe they're doing similar good, but just if you could comment on worms in general.
Yeah, I think, in my experience, I'll go back to if you build it, they will come, right? And again, if you're just adding invasive worms that have been shipped from somewhere else, that may not be the system that you want to build. And you're potentially actually adding to an imbalance in the system, right? By adding an invasive species that's going to compete with the native species potentially in a negative way. So, I rather than sort of buying something in a box at the garden center, I'm much more supportive of again, if you put sort of native plants and plant diversity, then the organisms come sort of with that, basically. And you might have to start with some tolerant cover crops, right? You might not be able to start with the most finicky plants, but if you start with some tolerant cover crops, if you think about, for example, like weeds, we're like the gardener's bane, but weeds are a disturbs system's answer to rebalancing itself, right? When you have a disturbance, all of these things come in, and then they change the environment in a way potentially that that will bring life back over time, right? It's an ecological concept called succession, and so if you just sterilize and start to start from scratch, that doesn't work very well. But if you let the system sort of grow organically, and I like sort of thinking about collaborating with nature, like as an ally instead of fighting with nature, you tend to be much more successful in the long run, right? It takes a little patience, but then there's also far fewer side effects on human and environmental health.
That's great. Mainly, I would say a lot of the other comments are just comments, great resources. I'm definitely going to take a closer look at what people have posted, and if there's anything great, I will throw that into the message I send out to the group. And I'll leave you with the last word, Julie, if you have any other comments, and then we'll sign off.
I can't think of anything else specific. Just love your soils. Don't panic too much about doing it wrong. Gardening and all of this is a lot about trial and error. So if you're adding compost, and if you're not dumping a bunch of chemicals, you're already making an improvement. And then the other improvements can come over time, right? Ask other gardeners, get on the website, become involved in organizations like the People and Pollinators Action Network, because they tend to attract other people that are also interested in working on these things. And then just go for it.
Wonderful. We will leave it at that, Julie. Much appreciated. I'm going to also send you the chat because there's lots of nice compliments there for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Joyce. Always happy to do it.
Okay. Take care, everybody.